Okay, so today we have Steve Paulson in to give a talk about his book Atoms in Eden. He's a contributor to the best of our knowledge on Wisconsin Public Radio, and should be a very good talk about science and religion. So this is Steve Paulson.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I have been working on this subject for about 4 years or so. So I'm going to play you, being a radio guy, play you a few excerpts from interviews I've done, and it will, I'm sure, answer all your questions about the connections between science and religion. You've probably heard about Stephen Hawking's new book where he says we don't need God to explain the design of the universe, but actually what's more interesting to me, at least, is his claim that science can finally answer some of the great existential questions, like why is there something rather than nothing, and why do we exist? Hawking writes, traditionally these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead because it hasn't kept up with developments in science. Of course, Hawking is wrong. Philosophy is not dead, and religion isn't dead either, but what's really interesting is how the intellectual assault on philosophy and religion has come so far. And I can cite another example. Sam Harris, the famous atheist, has a new book out called The Moral Landscape, in which he argues that we need a new understanding of morality based not on religion, but on science. He's out to demolish the idea that science is, by definition, a value-free space. So questions about meaning and purpose, those very things that philosophers and theologians have obsessed about for centuries, are now apparently in the realm of science. I have to say, I love these books. I love talking about them, love doing interviews about them, about these kinds of big ideas. And that's what my own book, Atoms in Eden, is all about. It's a collection of 20 interviews with a lot of the major figures in the science and religion debate from all kinds of perspectives. I talk with atheists and religious believers and with people whose views I cannot possibly even categorize. If there's an underlying agenda to my book, it's my conviction that we cannot understand the relationship between science and religion without looking at it from many different angles. We have to consider recent findings from evolutionary biology, quantum physics, cosmology, and neuroscience. We also need a solid grounding in theology, religious history, and what William James called the varieties of religious experience. This is a really complicated and fascinating subject. The science and religion debate is not just about evolution and creationism. There's one basic question that animates all of my interviews. What is a scientifically literate, rationally minded person, someone who's impatient with religious doctrine but open to spiritual experience, in other words, me, what is that person supposed to think about religion in the 21st century? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and I'm a radio guy, so I'll play a bunch of short audio clips that all go roughly between 1 and 3 minutes or so. These are from interviews I've done. Originally, they aired on the radio, but they also were always intended to be part of this book that I've just written. Then when I'm done, we'll open it up to questions and comments from you. I first came up with the idea for this book 4 years ago when I interviewed the renowned biologist E.O. Wilson, who grew up as a fundamentalist Southern Baptist in Alabama. In recent years, he's become one of the most outspoken critics of creationism. In my interview, he argued strongly against the possibility of any kind of divine intervention in the evolutionary process, and then we got to this point in the interview. I've heard you call yourself a deist.
Yeah, I don't want to be called an atheist.
Why not?
You know, being a good scientist and having been drawn up short so many times on my own theories, as all honest scientists are, I don't want to exclude the possibility of a creative force or deity. I think that would be a mistake. As Hans Kung, the theologian, once said, how are we to explain there is something and not nothing? Well, that's a question I'm happy to leave to the astrophysicist as to where the laws of the universe came and what is the meaning of the origin of existence. But I do feel confident there is no intervention of a deity in the origin of life and humanity.
So that's the distinction between theism and deism. And so
that is the distinction between. So I'm not a theist, but I'll be a provisional deist.
But no, just so I understand this, to be a deist, you're saying that maybe there was some creator, some presence
Maybe,
that set in
maybe
motion
that has not
the
been
laws
discounted. That's not discounted yet as a hypothesis. That's why I put the word provisional.
But it's fascinating because everything that you've said up until now suggests that you should be an atheist. Why sort of hold out that specter that, well, maybe there was some divine presence that got the whole thing going?
Well, because there's a possibility that a god or gods, I don't think it would resemble anything of the Judeo-Christian variety, or a super intelligent force came along, started the universe with a big bang, and then moved on to the next creation. I can't discount that.
A lot of the conversation about science and religion turns on how you understand a few key words like God, religion, and transcendence, and a great deal also rides on how much of reality you think can be explained by science. One of my favorite interviews was with Karen Armstrong, a British historian who's written a number of best-selling books, including A History of God and the memoir A Spiral Staircase, which charts her own spiritual journey from a young nun in a convent to atheist to how she now describes herself, a freelance monotheist. Don't ask. Her definition of religion is really interesting. She says none of the great religious prophets cared about big metaphysical systems or even about theology.
Jesus did not spend a great deal of time discoursing about the Trinity or original sin or the Incarnation or the Atonement, which have preoccupied later Christians. He went around doing good, being compassionate. And in the Quran, metaphysical speculation is regarded as self-indulgent guesswork, zanna. And it makes people, the Quran says, quarrelsome and stupidly sectarian. You can't prove these things one way or the other, so why quarrel about it? And I think sometimes the way monotheists talk about God is unreligious.
Unreligious, like the personal God, for instance?
Yes, because people very often talk about him as though he's a kind of acquaintance and whom they can second guess. People will say, God loves that, God wills that, and God despises the other. And very often the opinions of the deity are made to coincide exactly with those of the speaker.
And yet we certainly see talk of a personal God in various sacred texts. I mean, the people aren't just making that up.
No, but the great theologians in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam say, yes, you begin with the idea of a God who is personal. But God transcends personality as God transcends every other human characteristic, such as gender. You know, very often people hear about God at about the same time as they're learning about Santa Claus. But their ideas of Santa Claus mature and change in time, but their idea of God remains infantile.
What about the supernatural, though? Do you need any sense of the miraculous or of things that cannot be explained by science, by this world?
I think religions hold us in an attitude of awe and wonder. People such as the Buddha thought miracles were rather vulgar, you know, displays of power that often displays of ego. If you look at the miracles attributed to Jesus, the healing miracles, they generally had some kind of symbolic aspect about healing the soul, rather than showily showing off a supernatural power, you know, because that can be an exercise in egotism too.
Now, as you might guess, Richard Dawkins has a very different understanding of religion. Of course, Dawkins is an eminent biologist and the world's most famous atheist, and he's a really fun person to interview because he does not mince words. And I'm going to play a short excerpt from our interview, which was somewhat contentious, but a lot of fun.
I think that religious belief is a scientific belief in the sense that it makes claims about the universe which are essentially scientific claims.
What about the old adage that science deals with the how questions and religion deals with the why questions?
Yes, I think that's remarkably stupid, if I may say so. What on earth is a why question? there are why questions that mean something in a Darwinian world. We say, why do birds have wings to fly with? They don't mean that, though. They mean why in a sort of deliberate, purposeful sense. Those of us who don't believe in religion, supernatural religion, would say there is no such thing as a why question in that sense. Now, the mere fact that you can frame an English sentence beginning with the word why does not mean that that English sentence deserves or should receive an answer. I could say, why are unicorns hollow? That's a perfectly good English sentence. It appears to mean something, but you don't think that it deserves an answer.
But it seems to me that the big why questions are, why are we here? And what is our purpose in life? Okay, that's a what question, but it's basically a why question. And
no, that's right. It is a why question, but it's not a question that deserves an answer.
Well, but I think most people would say those questions which are central to the way most people think about their lives. I mean, those are the big existential questions, but those are also questions that are beyond science.
If you mean what is the purpose of the existence of the universe, then I'm saying that that is quite simply begging the question. If you happen to be religious, you think that's a meaningful question. Those of us who don't believe in a God will say that is as illegitimate as the question, why are unicorns hollow? It just shouldn't be put. It's not a proper question to put. It doesn't deserve an answer.
I guess I don't understand that. I mean, doesn't every person wonder about that? I mean, isn't that just sort of this core question of what are we doing in this world? Doesn't everyone struggle with that?
There are core questions. There are core questions like, how did the universe begin? Where do the laws of physics come from? Where does life come from? Why, after some period of billions of years, did life originate on this planet and then start evolving? Those are all perfectly legitimate questions to which science can give answers. If not now, then we hope in the future. There may be some very, very deep questions, perhaps even where do the laws of physics come from, that science will never answer. That is perfectly possible. I'm hopeful, along with some physicists, that science will one day answer that question. But even if they don't, even if there are some supremely deep questions to which science can never answer, what on earth makes you think that religion can answer those questions?
I'm not saying that religion can answer, but I guess my point is that people still ask those questions, and as you've very articulately said, they seem to be beyond the purview of science, but aren't they still legitimate questions to ask about, even if you can't get any definitive answer?
Well, a legitimate question is, where do the laws of physics come from? An illegitimate question, in my view, is, what is the purpose of the laws of physics? Because what is the purpose of the laws of physics implies that there's some kind of deliberate purpose giver or purpose thinker, which begs the question we're trying to answer, which is there a God?
So that is Richard Dawkins. Now, I have to tell you, it's really hard to get a clear understanding of the words God and religion. Take the case of Albert Einstein. There's a huge debate right now between religious believers and atheists over who gets to claim Einstein, the most famous scientist of the last century. And it's because Einstein himself made a number of rather cryptic comments. He called himself a deeply religious non-believer. He said science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind, and most famously he claimed God does not play dice with the universe. So the question is, who is this God that Einstein was talking about? I'm going to play you several different responses. The first is from Elaine Pagels, the famous scholar of the Gnostic Gospels, whose late husband was the noted physicist Heinz Pagels.
You know, part of the problem there is that Einstein used the language about God as a conscious metaphor. When he said God doesn't play dice with the universe, that is, he meant the universe is not put together in an accidental way. Einstein was speaking about God in the way that physicists would, aware that language like that is always going to be metaphorical, speaking about something beyond our understanding.
The Nobel Prize-winning physicist and atheist Steven Weinberg has a different take. He says Einstein was just using poetic language when he talked about religion, which from Weinberg's perspective was a big mistake.
Einstein, in a letter to a friend of his, famously explained that he did not believe in a God who cared about human beings, who was concerned with human affairs, that for him God was a synonym for harmony and order in the universe. In other words, when Einstein says God, he really is talking about the laws of nature or whatever fundamental principle governs the universe. Clearly, what he meant by God is so vague and so far from conventional religion that it seems to me a misuse of the word. I think the concept of God has historically had a fairly definite meaning. Of course, people have argued endlessly about the attributes of God, but there were common features: that God was conscious, that God was powerful, that God was benevolent to some extent. If you're not going to use the word God to mean something like that, something like its historical meaning, then I don't think you should use the word.
For a very different view, let's turn to Einstein's most recent biographer, Walter Isaacson. He says it's a mistake to dismiss Einstein's comments as strictly metaphorical. Isaacson claims that Einstein knew exactly what he was doing when he used words like God and religion.
At one point, some cardinal in Boston said, well, it still smacks of atheism because it's not a personal God. So Rabbi Goldstein, the head of the Reformed Jewish movement in New York, sends him a telegram and says, do you or do you not believe in God, Einstein? Answer 50 words or less. And Einstein says, I believe in Spinoza's God, a God whose spirit is manifest in the harmonies of the universe. I think the most important thing for Einstein is that there was a sense of humility. We do not know the answer here, but he did say he did have a belief in what he called his God, and a God as a creator.
Well, I think a lot of people just see this as, oh, he was exercising his poetic license. You know, he wanted to use God as kind of a synonym for mystery or something like that, but he took that word more seriously.
When he was asked whether he was using the word just symbolically or whatever, he said no, he wasn't. That he considered himself having a cosmic religion. He thought there was a spirit manifest in the laws of the universe, and to him that was his notion of God. Now, I know I've read Richard Dawkins, who says it's much more figurative. People kept saying, well, you're just speaking figuratively, and he says no.
There is, by the way, another really interesting piece of history. Many of the major figures in the development of 20th century physics, especially quantum physics, were fascinated by spiritual and philosophical ideas. Schrödinger had a profound Satori experience, and he was deeply influenced by Vedantic Hinduism. Heisenberg had similar experiences. Wolfgang Pauli was a patient of Carl Jung, and they carried on a correspondence for more than 30 years. In fact, Pauli became convinced that certain strange paranormal experiences were real, and there was the well-known Pauli effect. When he walked into the labs of other scientists, their equipment kept breaking to the point where they actually told him to stay away. Apparently, this did not happen in Pauli's own laboratory. Then a little later, David Bohm, whom Einstein once considered his successor, had a very intense friendship with the Indian mystic Krishnamurti. These were all great, hard-nosed scientists, but they were also philosophers who were humbled by the revelations of modern physics. They thought the nature of material reality was profoundly mysterious, and my guess is they would find Stephen Hawking's recent comments about God and the death of philosophy to be a bit simplistic. I want to come back to the question of language because it's so important to the public conversation about science and religion. There's a really fascinating movement right now among some secular scientists and philosophers. They tend to go by the name religious naturalists. And these people want to appropriate the word religion. And while they don't believe in God, they are impatient with the hardcore atheists who simply want to dismiss religion. One of the most provocative arguments comes from the biologist Stuart Kauffman, one of the gurus of complexity theory and a recipient of a MacArthur Genius Award. He doesn't just want to reclaim the word religion, he wants to change the meaning of the word God. Kauffman wrote a book called Reinventing the Sacred, but his notion of the sacred is rooted in science. He talks about God as the ceaseless creativity in the universe, which he calls stunning, awesome, and worthy of reverence. And he rejects the scientific idea that everything can be reduced ultimately to the laws of physics. Kauffman believes that biology has its own unpredictable properties, and he says life, value, meaning, and consciousness are all things that emerge as part of this creative universe. But I still wasn't clear why he wanted to invent a whole new meaning for the word God.
God is the most powerful symbol humanity has created. We've been worshiping God or gods at least since the sacred Earth Mother 10,000 years ago in Europe. Whether it's the creator, transcendent God of the Abrahamic tradition or other notions of God, God carries with it a sense of awe, reverence, wonder, that no other symbol carries. Now we have our choice. Is it more astonishing to believe that a creator God created everything that has come to exist, the planets, the galaxies, chemistry, life, consciousness, agency, in 6 days? Or is it equally or even more astonishing and awesome to believe what is almost certainly the truth, namely that all of this came to be all on its own?
Okay, you can say all that, but you don't have to talk about God. And yet you, for some reason, want to invoke...
I want to invoke God.
Yeah, why?
It is precisely to say that God is nature, or God is in nature. And that's the God of Spinoza. That's the God that Einstein believed in. If we can transfer our secular humanist, consumerist worldview into one in which we have this sense of responsibility, awe, and wonder for all life, we are inventing a global ethic that we don't have now, yet we need it to sustain the global civilization that's emerging.
Clearly, one of the big landmines in the science and religion debate is evolution. Various polls show that roughly half of all Americans believe the Earth is no more than 10,000 years old, and 3/4 of Americans say the Bible is the Word of God. This may be partly a reaction to comments by certain atheists. For instance, the philosopher Daniel Dennett has talked about Darwinism as a kind of universal acid. It eats away at everything it touches, including, in his view, God as creator. To me, the biggest intellectual challenge that the theory of evolution poses to religion has nothing to do with the story of Genesis. It's very obvious that you cannot reconcile a literal reading of the Bible with modern science. The real question is whether you can believe in both underlying purpose and natural selection, this very gradual process of random genetic mutations. Stephen Jay Gould believed that if you reran the tape of evolution, you would get a totally different result. You would certainly not end up with human beings again. And this view has major theological implications. It raises the specter that humans are just a lucky evolutionary accident with no inherent meaning or purpose. So I don't think it's surprising that many religious believers find evolution very troubling. Now, in my mind, one of the most intriguing responses to Gould comes from the Cambridge University paleontologist Simon Conway Morris. His theory of convergence argues that the outcomes of evolution are highly constrained. There are only so many ways that creatures can evolve. The most controversial part of his argument is his claim that the evolution of Homo sapiens, or intelligent creatures very much like us, was inevitable once life started on Earth.
Practically everything which makes us human is already present in a nascent form in one or other group of animals. This is not to say that every single species on the planet is trying to turn into humans. What I'm trying to say is that because of the striking convergences in the mental worlds, famously between crows and the great apes, but also dolphins, from that perspective, if we're first on the block, fine, but there are many other groups of animals which are really not so far behind.
But aren't human beings here by a massive stroke of luck? I mean, the asteroid that hit the Earth 63 million years ago that wiped out the dinosaurs, and if that asteroid had never hit, wouldn't dinosaurs have continued to dominate the Earth and prevent large mammals from evolving, including humans?
Oh, I think that's absolutely correct. I think if the asteroid had sailed past harmlessly, and thank goodness nearly all asteroids do, then indeed the dinosaurs would be here at the present day. But what I want you to now imagine, in fact, is we've now got to fast forward our conversation by about 30 million years. And I'm afraid I have to tell you that the dinosaurs have now disappeared. They've been hunted to extinction. And we're still sitting in the studio, and we are using advanced technology.
Who hunted the dinosaurs into extinction?
One or other group of warm-blooded creatures. It could have been the birds, sometimes underestimated, but more likely, I think, the mammals. So the asteroid hits, bang, okay, right, dinosaurs gone, big reptiles gone. Birds and mammals look at each other and say, well, this is a wonderful opportunity, let's evolve. But that asteroid misses. It's a counterfactual history. What's going to happen? Well, my view is, fortunately for us, but unfortunately for the dinosaurs, around about 20 million years after the asteroid missed, the world is actually beginning to get surprisingly cold. We're starting the great ice ages, which culminated in the last 3 or 4 million years. Now, in this counterfactual world, you've got the temperate and the polar regions, which are persistently cold. Now, we have good reason to think that dinosaurs are not effectively warm-blooded. We know that birds and mammals, by and large, are more intelligent than the reptiles. We know that they're more socially adept, and we know convergently that they evolve a proto-technology. They're tool makers. So then one says, what's going to happen next? Well, my sense would be that sooner or later, one or other group of hunters is going to emerge. It doesn't have to be exactly the same history as what we had on this planet, but the end result will be the same. What happened when the hunting really got going, especially in North America and to some extent Africa and also Australia, is all the big mammals disappeared. What would have happened in that counterfactual world would have been that it would have been a Tyrannosaurus going down under a hail of arrows and spears rather than the mastodon, for instance, in North America.
I should add that Simon Conway Morris is a Christian. He believes evolution has direction, but he's very cautious about saying it has some purpose or endpoint. He says those are religious ideas rather than scientific concepts. Francis Collins is another prominent Christian scientist, and he may be uniquely situated to play a key role in the science and religion debate. As the former head of the Human Genome Project and the current director of the National Institutes of Health, he's one of America's most visible scientists, and he has impeccable scientific credentials, a medical degree as well as a PhD in quantum mechanics. He has a distinguished track record as a gene hunter. He's also an evangelical Christian, someone who has no qualms about professing his belief in miracles or seeing God's hand behind all of creation. In his book, The Language of God, he tries to stake out the middle ground between Darwinian atheists and religious fundamentalists. I asked Francis Collins the same question I asked Simon Conway Morris. Isn't it a lucky accident that the asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs, paving the way eventually for humans? Here is his answer.
I don't think so. I can see the arguments that you just voiced and why they trouble people, but they are based upon the idea that God has the same limitations that we do. We are limited to the arrow of time. We cannot contemplate what it is like to be able to affect the future and the present and the past all at once. But God is not so limited. What appears random to us, such as an asteroid hitting the Earth, need not have been random to him at all. As soon as you accept the idea of God as creator, then the randomness argument essentially goes out the window.
Now, is this to say that God set that asteroid in motion that wiped out the dinosaurs so that eventually human beings could evolve?
Oh goodness, that's getting into more specific details than I would dare to imagine, but I would dare to say that God had a plan of creatures like us. Need they have looked exactly like us? Or is in his image an indication of the spirit, the moral law, the free will, the sense of who we are, the consciousness? In which case, perhaps it didn't matter so much whether that ended up occurring in mammals or some other life form.
Well, I guess I'm trying to figure out if you think that God intervenes in the affairs of human beings, because virtually all of your argument so far is no, God stays out of that realm of humanity.
I think God can intervene. I think that's what the great miracles are. Certainly God intervened in the person of Jesus Christ and in the most amazing miracle of all, of the resurrection. But I don't think God sort of pops up in lots of circumstances and turns around the course of events. I think those are reserved for special moments of special significance with a special lesson involved.
Well, I have to ask you about a couple of the best-known miracles in the Bible. Do you believe in the virgin birth?
I do.
And the resurrection? Do you believe that what was resurrected was the physical body of Jesus?
Physical body, we should be careful in terms of exactly what you mean by that. Does that mean the cellular structure was exactly the same as it was when he was alive? I don't know, but I believe that he was resurrected in physical form and seen by witnesses who he spoke to before he then ascended. That is the absolute cornerstone of the Christian faith.
But how can you, as a scientist, accept some of these ideas in the Bible because they cut so directly against the laws of nature?
I have no trouble at all because, again, the big decision is, do you believe in God? If you believe in God, and if God is more than nature, then there's no reason that God could not stage an invasion into the natural world, which to our limited perspective would appear to be a miracle.
One of the major points of contention in the whole science and religion debate is about consciousness, specifically the relationship between brain and mind. And the big question is whether the mind is strictly a product of the physical mechanics of the brain, the neurons and synaptic connections. I actually think this and not evolution is now the cutting edge of the science and religion debate. Think about it. If your mind can communicate with God or some kind of larger intelligence, or if there really is life after death, then consciousness must go beyond the purely physical mechanics of the brain. There are really two questions here. First, is there any part of the mind that can operate independently of the brain? And second, will brain science ever be able to explain how the mind works? I've asked lots of people these questions, and here's an excerpt from my interview with the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who makes the argument for a materialist view of consciousness.
Well, there's lots of puzzles, aren't any mysteries. I don't think we have any truly mind-boggling perplexities. There's plenty of very hard problems out there, but I don't think consciousness is a mystery.
But there are all kinds of things that I can't imagine how science will ever be able to explain. For instance, the precise nature of how we love someone else. I mean, I'm not talking about the sex drive here, but I'm talking about the mystery of love, or why we have certain kinds of dreams. And dreams, of course, are not rooted at all in the physical world. I mean, if you dissect the brain somehow and look at all the neural connections, do you think science will ever be able to explain those things?
Sure. In what sense of explain? Let's build up to it, because science doesn't do this all in one fell swoop. There's modest inroads. Would you find it just unimaginable that science might, in the next 15 or 20 years, be able to read people's brains while they sleep and then write down what they're actually dreaming? Would you give me that kind of mind reading?
I don't think I
would.
We
can't do it yet. We can do it a little bit.
I don't give you that, actually.
Well, then hang on to your hat, because
okay.
That's coming. We can.
You're saying science will be able to do that without any kind of self-reporting by the dreamer?
Oh no, we'll use waking reports by dreamers, of course, to calibrate the instruments and understand how to decode the neural signals.
See, that's my point. That's my point. If you don't ask the person what they're dreaming, will you ever be able to decipher the dreams?
Well, let's build up to it then. So we ask the person what they're dreaming for 100 nights, and we build up a nice library, and we translate the relevant brain states for that person, and it will probably go person for person. I don't suppose it's going to be the same from one brain to the next. But then the idea that one might then be able to say a little bit later, oh, look, Jones is having that dream about the old car, and look, he's falling over a cliff now. And we wake him up, and that's what he reports. If you think that's just beyond the reach of science, I think you're wrong.
But that's just correlation. That's just,
that's right.
You're just looking at what so-and-so has dreamed, and you're just going to match the brain imaging to some future dream. That still doesn't explain how within the brain that particular kind of dream is generated.
Yeah, well, so then we have to do that too, but I think we're making good progress on that too. But we can't do that now. Might we do that in the future? Certainly.
Ken Wilber is a very different kind of philosopher. Unlike the reductionism of Dan Dennett, Wilber embraces what he calls an integral philosophy, a theory of consciousness with an explicitly spiritual dimension. He says a materialist understanding of consciousness simply doesn't get you anywhere.
If you're looking at just material stuff like a planet that doesn't have life on it or a rock, a physicist can tell you where that planet's going to be, barring other forces, 1,000 years from now. But that physicist cannot tell you where my dog's going to be 2 seconds from now. It reduces everything. I mean, if that's the case, then your statement itself and your awareness is nothing but neurochemical fireworks, and you can make no distinctions of value. There is no such thing as, love is better than hate. All those value distinctions are erased.
You can't make the value distinctions, but is there still anything to say that scientific view is wrong?
Well, at this point, of course, you enter the philosophy of science, and the argument is endless. Is there nothing but physical stuff in the universe, or is there some sort of interiority? We're not talking about ghosts and goblins and souls and all that kind of stuff. Just, is there interiority? Is there an inside to the universe? And if there is interiority, as there is exteriority, then that interiority is where consciousness resides and where values reside. And you can't see that, but it's real.
I've put the brain-mind question to dozens of people in my interviews, and I've gotten lots of different answers. Even prominent atheists are all over the map on the question of consciousness. Unlike Dennett, Richard Dawkins told me, and I quote, "Consciousness is the biggest puzzle facing biology, neurobiology, computational studies, and evolutionary biology. It is a very, very big problem." Steven Pinker, the well-known cognitive psychologist, does not think science will ever figure out how the mind works by studying neurons and brain chemistry. To understand the mind, he says you have to look at higher levels of mental organization. And then there's Sam Harris, who may be the most vicious critic of religion of them all, but he's also a longtime Buddhist meditator who's quite open about his own spiritual experiences. And to my astonishment, he even told me about having had telepathic experiences. Here's the very end of my interview with Sam Harris. You are a neuroscientist. Do you think there's any chance that human consciousness can survive after death?
I just don't know. One thing I can tell you is that we don't know what the actual relationship between consciousness and the physical world is. There are good reasons to be skeptical of the naive conception of a soul. We know that almost everything we take ourselves to be subjectively, all of our cognitive powers, our ability to understand language, this is mediated by the brain. And yet we do not know what the relationship between subjectivity and objectivity ultimately is. And for instance, we could be living in a universe where consciousness goes all the way down to the bedrock, so that there is some interior subjective dimension to an electron, say. And we would not expect to see any evidence of this. And so I'm actually quite skeptical of our ever being able to resolve that question, what the real relationship between consciousness and matter ultimately is.
That's interesting, though, because most evolutionary biologists, I mean, particularly thinking the secular ones, would say, of course, consciousness cannot survive the brain. It will not survive death. You are not willing to make that claim.
Yeah, I just don't know. I'm just trying to be honest about my gradations of certainty. And I think consciousness poses a unique problem. And if we were living in a universe where consciousness survived death in some sense, or just transcended the brain so that single neurons were conscious, we would not expect to see it by our present techniques of neuroimaging or cellular neuroscience, and we would never expect to see it.
Now, I should say that even if you reject the materialist understanding of consciousness, you don't necessarily get to God. Sam Harris certainly doesn't think so. What it does mean is that you believe there are other dimensions of reality that contemporary science has a very hard time explaining, and it opens the door to various spiritual realities. Now, I have to say I'm particularly fascinated by mystical experience, and this is partly what led me, surprisingly, to Jane Goodall, the famed field biologist. Her discoveries about chimpanzees revolutionized the field of primatology and really our understanding of what it means to be human. What is less well known is that Goodall also has a mystical side, and in fact even talks about having had a paranormal vision of her dead husband. And on a personal note, I will add that Jane Goodall was my hero. When I was growing up, I wanted to be like her, and I was an intern at the National Zoo's field station in Front Royal, Virginia. Right when I finished high school, I spent 6 months out there because I wanted to do what Jane Goodall did. Well, it didn't work out that way, and here I am in public radio, and I have the great privilege of interviewing people like Jane Goodall, and here is a portion of that interview. Did you find yourself wondering what was happening inside the mind of a chimpanzee?
Constantly. I still maintain if I could be inside the mind of a chimpanzee for just a few minutes, I would learn more about them than another goodness knows how many years of study, because we can guess what they're thinking, but how do they think? How do they think? Are they thinking in pictures? How do you think without words? I spent ages thinking about that, wondering about it.
Were there any particular moments when you felt like you had a better understanding of that?
One moment was very, very special, and that was when I was sitting in the forest with David Greybeard, and I picked up a fruit and held it out to him, and he turned his head away, and I put my hand closer, and he turned, looking directly into my eyes. He reached out, took the fruit, dropped it, he really didn't want it, and then he very gently squeezed my hand, which is how chimpanzees reassure each other. And so in that moment, we communicated in a way that seems to predate words, perhaps in a way that was used by our own common ancestor millions of years ago. And it was an extraordinary feeling. It was bridging these two worlds.
It sounds like you're very drawn to this whole idea of somehow knowing the world without language, without words.
I am fascinated by it. I always have been. I mean, we think with words. And when we don't think with words, I think we come close to what mystics might describe as a mystical experience, because I don't think that words would come into that.
Did you have experiences like that at Gombe? I mean, what we would call mystical experiences?
Yeah, sometimes. One was just when I'd been following a little group of chimpanzees and I was very wet, and they climbed in the evening up into this tree which had new shoots of beautiful lime green, and the sun behind them was making them shine, and the trunks of the trees were still wet, and the chimpanzees' coats were black ebony shot with little gleams of chestnut, and the smell of ripe figs was strong in the air. And then this beautiful male bushbuck appeared with his coat dark with the rain and his spiraled horns gleaming, and just stood there. And it seemed I could hear the insects really loud and clear, and it was just incredibly vivid beingness and being at one with that beautiful world.
Sounds like you lost your sense of your own self.
Well, that's it. Totally losing sense of one's own self. And that's the only way I can really study animals, because if I'm on my own, I forget that I'm there.
Now, I was going to end with that excerpt, but if you will indulge me, I want to play one last clip. This from a second interview with Richard Dawkins when he came through Madison, where I live, not long ago, because it pertains to these questions about how we define religion. And frankly, for a radio guy, Dawkins is just irresistible. I came across a book that has just come out by Chris Hedges, the former New York Times reporter. The book is called I Don't Believe in Atheists. And I want to quote a passage from his book and get your reaction. He writes, "The question is not whether God exists. It is whether we contemplate or are utterly indifferent to the transcendent, that which cannot be measured or quantified, that which lies beyond the reach of rational deduction. We all encounter this aspect of existence in love, beauty, alienation, loneliness, suffering, good, evil, and the reality of death. These powerful, non-rational, super-real forces in human life are the domain of religion." What do you make of that assessment of religion?
Bullshit. I mean, let's go through that. Was the word transcendent? Or I've forgotten the word.
Transcendent was one of his words, yes.
Okay. Now, in science, there are plenty of things that we don't know. So that's the first thing to get out of the way. Science is not a kind of know-it-all. We've got it all taped. There are going to be, in the next few hundred years, new scientific discoveries, new scientific insights, new scientific ideas, theories, which will be mind-boggling. So that's the first point. Now, he then went on to things like love and
alienation, suffering,
yes.
Reality of death.
Okay. Now, these are, of course, not immediately understandable by science in detail, just as when I look at a computer, I don't actually understand every detail of how it's doing what it is doing. However, that doesn't mean that anything mystical is going on. That passage you read to me is obscurantist rubbish, because it implies that that which is complicated and therefore hard to understand is therefore in principle impossible to understand, which means there's got to be something supernatural going on. Supernatural means nothing. It explains nothing. It's a cop-out.
And that is all. Thank you. And I am happy to take questions, comments. I understand that I think you need to speak into the microphone here if you want to do that. So?
I was actually just wondering with, it seems like in the political discourse lately there's a lot of religious questions or conclusions being drawn, and it sounds like they're very different from the questions and conclusions of the people that you interviewed, even the more religious ones. So I was wondering if you ever spoke with them about that, or if they had any comments on how it's kind of shaped what's going on these days.
Well, to some degree, I think you can't avoid it. I mean, I find sort of how religion enters the political discourse to usually not very interesting, because it's just, it raises all of these sort of gut reactions. I will say that I think if you want to trace why there is so much interest and attention to the so-called new atheists in recent years, most prominently Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens. I really think that a lot of that is a reaction to 9/11. And they will say that. In fact, Sam Harris will say that the reason that he wrote his first book, The End of Faith, was explicitly a reaction to his horror of sort of the motivation of the people who flew the planes into the Twin Towers, and also the reaction among a lot of Americans to use religious language in the immediately the post 9/11 era. I mean, going back to George W. Bush, talking about the axis of evil. So, I mean, it was religious language was clearly entering the political discourse there, and the other piece of this is, if you're an aspiring presidential candidate, you gotta cite your religious credentials. I mean, you sort of have to sort of show that you if not actually go to church, you are respectful of religion. I mean, you're going to be in trouble if you don't. In fact, a few years ago, there was a Congressman, Pete Stark, in California, who actually made news because he was apparently the first national politician who ever came out and said he was an atheist, which is kind of astonishing when you think about it. So, I mean, it's a very loaded question here. The questions that I'm interested in are more the intellectual question. It's really on one level, it's clear that you can reconcile science and religion. I mean, you can say you believe in everything about modern science, and you also believe in God. The question is, does that hold up intellectually? I mean, that's really what I'm interested in. I mean, and that's why I sort of go through a lot of these different dimensions. And I think there are different answers depending on what the question is you're asking. So, I mean, there are sort of a certain set of issues that come up if you're talking about the mind and the brain, consciousness. I mean, those are sort of neuroscience questions, as well as philosophy of mind questions. There are different questions that come up in cosmology, origins of the universe, the Big Bang. And then there are all kinds of different questions that come up in evolution. And, is it just an accident that we're here? And then there are also separate religious questions as well. I mean, a big question is, how do you read the Bible or the Quran? How do you read a sacred text? And I mean, it's obvious that you cannot read that literally if you're going to accept modern science. Okay, if you don't read it literally, how do you read it? And that's a really complicated subject. And so I have several people, I didn't go into that in the talk here, but there are several people who kind of wrestle with that question. I have a Muslim astrophysicist who talks about that, who's an observant Muslim. But he would also say he doesn't believe in miracles, but he has a very interesting sort of nuanced take on sort of his understanding of Muhammad and where his visions came from. And Elaine Pagels, the Gnostic Gospels scholar, who I played a very short clip from her, and really her project is to try to go back to a lot of the early Christian texts and to interpret them without resorting to supernatural explanations. So unlike Francis Collins, for instance, who would say that if you're going to be a Christian, you have to believe in the virgin birth, you have to believe in the literal resurrection of Jesus, she would say no. You can look at, depending on which text you look at, you can read some of those and, sort of the stories of the resurrection, and you could say, people felt something there. They didn't necessarily see anything. And that's, I mean, if you think about that, there are huge implications there and for all those people who want to embrace Christianity. Maybe that's the church they grew up in, but, sort of stumble over that because they just can't kind of wrap their heads around the sort of what they would perceive to be the dogma that's thrown at them. And so there are these different ways of interpreting it. There's another person in my book, John Haught, who's a Catholic theologian at Georgetown. He would say that if you had a camera at the resurrection, it wouldn't have shown anything. That's sort of beyond science. And he's a Catholic theologian, and he would say that this is not that unorthodox a view. So anyway, it's really interesting and complicated when you start digging down into a lot of these issues.
I just had a really quick question. So, what was sort of from all these conversations a conclusion that you got for yourself? And then is this going to lead you to do something in the future to continue with this work? Because this seems like the first step. So what's next for you?
Very good questions. I would say, well, just a little bit of background about me. I was raised in a congregational church, which never really did much for me, frankly. So I stopped going around, I don't know, when I was 12 or 13 or so, and I've never gone to church again, other than, the occasional Christmas service. I don't meditate or pray. I'm a pretty secular person. I'm also someone who, I have a little bit of religion envy in me. And I guess I sort of look for the sacred. I mean, I want to have some sense of the sacred in my life, but how do I get that without kind of the religious dogma that a lot of organized religions have? And that's kind of what led me to this project, and that's why I'm particularly drawn to the people who are really wrestling with some of these fundamental ideas about, how do we define religion? How do we define God? I mean, you start asking people, I mean, I don't even ask my closest friends, what do you think about God? That's, you just sort of, have to be a little careful about going there. But, I get to ask these people I interview about that. I mean, that's the great thing about being a radio interviewer. And they kind of have to answer me, when the microphone is sitting right in front of them. And it's just, it's tough to get a handle on that. And so I guess I'm searching for ways that I would call myself a sort of a lapsed Christian who's not a strict materialist. How's that for kind of a double negative? So someone who's kind of out there searching for something. I'm not exactly sure what it is. I'm definitely not in the strict atheist camp. And I'm not sure if agnostic really I'm not even sure what that means. And I don't think that really describes me very well. I think I'm something else. And in terms of where this might lead me, I'm not sure. I still do interviews on the radio on these subjects. I just interviewed Sam Harris about his new book, The Moral Landscape, where he makes this argument that we can come up with moral arguments based strictly on science, obviously not religion, and I think he can make a few arguments like that. I think it's kind of limited how far you can go. I've thought about if I were to do a follow-up book right now, I might do something that would be a little on some of the issues that I've touched on here, but it might be having to do more specifically with people who kind of invoke nature, sort of the nature spirituality intersection there. And there's a fascinating new book by an animist philosopher named David Abram called Becoming Animal, which is, he's someone who has hung out with a lot of shamans in Latin America and Asia, and he's a sleight of hand magician as well, and he actually sees his connection as a magician there's something similar between that and what shamans do in a lot of traditional cultures, and he would say it's all about kind of disorienting us and sort of taking us to another sort of conceptual space. And again, he's not invoking God anywhere here. He's not really invoking anything supernatural, but he is saying there seems to be some sort of other dimension there. Anyway, it's like I find that very interesting, and I'm also interested in, this is going to seem like a total non sequitur here, but I don't know if you know the fantasy writer Neil Gaiman. Who wrote Coraline and American Gods, and there was just a big event, in fact, out near where I live in Madison, at House on the Rock, this kind of weird touristy attraction about an hour from Madison. He set a key scene in his book American Gods there, sort of like the birth of modern mythology, American mythology, at this tourist trap in the middle of Wisconsin. And he says, this is the creation of a homegrown mythology. And so what he's trying to do in his work is sort of bring a sense of enchantment, of saying that there's stuff that's going on underneath the surface there. There's sort of magic in a way. You don't necessarily have to invoke the supernatural here, but there are different ways of looking at the world, and I'm very drawn to that. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's sort of a roundabout way of getting at this.
Hey, sorry I came in late. I just have a question, though. Have you seen any scientific examples in the religious books, the Torah, Bible, or Quran, of things that are explained there prior to when we know humans discovered it, quote unquote? Are there examples?
Oh, sure, there are all kinds of.
For example, like in the Quran, there are examples of embryology,
right,
orbits of planets and stuff like that before, supposedly, they were known about. So are there examples that you know of?
There are lots. I mean, actually, in Islam, I mean, I'm not an expert on Islam, but I can talk about this a little bit. The Muslim astrophysicist who I just mentioned, he talks about how this is this huge thing in the Muslim world of looking to the Quran or looking to some of those original scriptures and trying to say, oh, look, this is what was said about, well, there's the creation story of Adam. You know, the Adam of Adam and Eve was created out of dust. I mean, that's sort of the idea in the Quran. And so, I mean, there you can sort of go through a lot of this, and this just infuriates this guy who I interviewed. He said, I mean, this is just nonsense. To say, you know, to try to go back and look at, you know, clues that maybe something was said in the Bible or the Quran that would somehow show that, you know, these sacred texts understood science before modern scientists have come to that. And I'll just let me tell you a little story, in fact, sort of about Islam, not quite on your question, but there's a really fascinating movement in the Islamic world, a creationist movement. So we tend to think of creationism as a distinctively American phenomenon, and actually it's a huge growing movement throughout the Muslim world. And there's a guy named Harun Yahya, that's his pen name. His real name is Adnan Akhtar, who's in Istanbul, and he is the leading Islamic creationist. And he has a media empire, and he puts out, he and his organization, he has maybe a few hundred people in Turkey. They put out all this literature, really high gloss books and videos and all of this stuff, and it is spread throughout not just Turkey, throughout the Muslim world, in Muslim communities in Europe and America. And he's kind of a reclusive figure too. And I was in Istanbul actually a couple of years ago, and I went and interviewed him, and it was kind of a bizarre experience, I have to say. First of all, he is he's actually been convicted of a crime of running an extortion gang, and he's not in prison right now. He's appealing the decision, and he's got sort of very powerful friends and enemies in Turkey. And so I thought, well, you know, this is, you know, I sort of have to see what this Islamic creationist, you know, what would that be like? And so I set up this interview with him, and one of his people came to my hotel and picked me up and drove me across Islam at 10 o'clock, across Istanbul, 10 o'clock at night, and they, the driver pulled at one point off the road and in-hopped the translator because Harun Yahya doesn't speak English, and these two guys started sort of having this friendly argument about, you know, one of them has BBC sort of English, the other has more Turkish English, you know, which is better for picking up girls. And I was thinking, this is not really my idea of an Islamic creationist. And then I finally get out to Harun Yahya's house, and it's this really modern house with huge plasma TV screen, swimming pool out the back through these glass doors, and then the weirdest thing of all is I walk into the house and it's a stage set. There are these 3 Klieg lights, video cameras, and they were going to tape my interview, which is what they ended up doing. So I had my little, you know, radio thing, and they have all these TV cameras there, and then, so when I started the interview, and he was very gracious, and they're all very gracious when I was doing this interview, and so I asked, so how could all the evolutionary biologists be wrong? And he said, well, they're controlled by the Masons. And I said, wow, I think they'd be a little surprised to hear that they're controlled by the Masons. He said, well, that's because the Masons keep everything secret. And then he went on to say that he equated the Darwinists with a satanic cult. And he said they're kind of in league with fascists and communists, but they sort of breed like mosquitoes in a pond. And I was sort of, this is not my usual kind of interview that I do. And I'm sort of thinking, wow, you know, where can I go with this? And then at one point, I asked him, so how would you assess your influence? And then he pulled out a loose leaf notebook, and he had clippings because he gets a lot of media attention. And so he read articles from Liberación, various leading European newspapers and magazines that were all quoting him, and sort of saying Darwinism is on the run and all. And what I realized is what he wants is publicity, and even bad publicity is good publicity for him, which led to some moral quandaries about what should I do with the story. But yet, on the other hand, I sort of came away thinking that he is making inroads. He's got huge influence, he and his little empire, the media empire there. And if you don't say anything, they go around to various countries, and they tell the Muslims there that you can't accept evolution. Modern science is on the wrong track, and there are obviously other people who there are lots of people, Muslim intellectuals, who would disagree with that. But one of the key differences between, say, creationism in the Islamic world and creationism in America is here it's it's huge. There are lots of people who are creationists, but it's kind of a subculture still. It's not official culture. If you are a creationist, it's, with maybe a few exceptions with some of our elected officials, you have to be a little careful about how you talk about that. You don't have to be that careful. It's perfectly accepted in a lot of Islamic countries to be upfront about creationism and just to say that evolution is nonsense. So that's a battle that will play out more. It's more of an issue right now in Turkey because they have this peculiar history with their old president Ataturk, who was the secular figure. And so evolution has been taught for decades in Turkey, hasn't been taught in a lot of other Muslim countries, and so they haven't really come to the big evolution debate, which probably will happen as they sort of build up their science and technology infrastructure. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much.